cutie, I'm back. And today we have another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile. If you're new here, welcome to my channel and welcome to the Cute Life. I'm your cult leader, Leah. If you're not new here, thank you for returning for another cult meeting. Sometimes, as often as I can, I do a series called Beauty and the Bibliophile where I do my makeup and I tell you about the latest book that I've read. If you don't know what a bibliophile is, it is a lover and collector of books like me. Today's book isn't really a book. It's a story that I have taken out of my complete collection of the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. And it's one of my favorite Disney fairy tales, Cinderella. But you shall see that this version is very different from the Disney version. Now, this story, there's no exact date, at least that I could find, that this story came out, or at least this version of Cinderella. The Brothers Grimm, they did not make up this story. This was a folk tale that existed long before they did, but they decided to interpret it and write it down. In fact, all of the fairy tales that they've written down in this collection are along the same lines. Now, this version of Cinderella, like I said, is nothing like the Disney version. It's actually quite horrific in some ways and could actually be considered like a horror story. So if you are interested in hearing the horror version of Cinderella while you watch me do my makeup, well, stick around. All right, so Cinderella by the Brothers Grimm, and this was written over 200 years ago. Couldn't get an exact date or year, but it seems to be like the early 1800s. Now, once upon a time, the wife of a rich man fell very sick. And when she felt like it was about her time, she called her only daughter to her bedside. And she told her to always be a good girl. And if she was, God would always be with her and protect her, and that her mother, would always be looking down on her from heaven. And then she died. So after her mom died, she would go out to her grave every day and cry. The grave was there on the property of their estate. And despite the fact that this girl was very sad, depressed over her mother, she remained good. Now, about a year later, her father, but I think he's actually her stepfather. And I didn't quite grasp this fact until towards the end, which we'll discuss. Anyway, so her stepfather remarried, and this new woman brought with her her two daughters. Now, unlike the Disney story, these two sisters were actually very beautiful, but they were vile and had ugly hearts. And so this became a time that was very bad for Cinderella. These two sisters were obviously extremely jealous of Cinderella. Why, the story didn't exactly say, but they would mock her, make fun of her. And then one day, when they were all eating dinner, they turned to their mother and their now stepfather and were like, is she really gonna like sit at the dinner table with us? And their mother and the two sisters forced Cinderella to become a kitchen wench. And they took her nice clothes and they dressed her in rags and then took her to the kitchen and told her that she was supposed to cook and clean and do all this hard work that they didn't want to do, I guess. And it was at this point that I was like, okay, wait a minute. Is this guy like her actual father? Because like what father would just be okay with that? So anyway, she would have to get up super early in the morning and light the fires, do all the cooking and the wash. And on top of all this, the two sisters would just do everything they could to make her life hell. They would mock her. They would get all the peas and lentils and they would pour them into the ash of the fireplace so that she'd be forced to have to pick them all out one by one. And then in the evenings, she didn't even have a bedroom to retire to and get some rest. In fact, she didn't even have a bed. So she had to sleep on the floor next to the fireplace. And because of this, she always had ash and dirt all over her. And they would call her Cinderella because of this, because of the cinders. Now one day, the father, he had to go out of town or something. And he asked all the girls, Cinderella and the two stepsisters, what they wanted him to bring back for them. And the stepsisters, one of them asked for pretty dresses and another one asked for jewels. And then he was like, okay, Cinderella, what do you want? And Cinderella asked for something a little odd. She asked him that, she was like, when you're on your way home and if a branch of a tree or a bush brushes against you and knocks your hat off, bring me that twig or branch. And he was like, okay. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. When he was riding home, he brushed up against a hazel tree or bush and his hat got knocked off. So he pulled the branch from the tree and he gave it to Cinderella. Now Cinderella took that branch and she took it out to her mother's grave and she planted it. And then she began to cry so much that it watered the branch and it grew into a beautiful hazel tree. And she would go out to this tree 3 times a day and she would cry for her mother and she would pray. And there was always a little bird in the tree. And if Cinderella was ever, while she was praying or crying or whatever, expressed some kind of wish for some sort of material thing, the bird would drop it out of the tree. Now one day the king decided that he was going to have a 3-day festival and invite all the young ladies of the kingdom so that his son could choose a bride. Now when the stepsisters found out about this, they were very excited, a chance to meet the prince, and he was looking for a bride. Great, we've got construction again. And they started yelling at Cinderella to help them get their dresses ready and get their hair done. And of course, Cinderella, she was a good girl, so she helped. But she was very sad because, you know, she kind of wanted to go to the festival too. So Cinderella begs her stepmother if she can go as well. But her stepmother's like, you can't go. She's like, you don't have the right dress or shoes to wear. So no, you can't go. But Cinderella actually persisted and she continued to ask and kind of annoy her stepmother, continuing to ask if she could go. So finally, the stepmother's like, she goes over to the fireplace and she's like, takes a bowl of lentils and she dumps them all out into the fireplace. And she tells Cinderella, she's like, listen, if you can pick out all of these lentils within the next 2 hours, then you can go. And she leaves her to it. So Cinderella has a little trick up her sleeve. She goes out into the garden and she starts calling all the little birds in the whole area. And they all fly into the kitchen and they help her pick out the lentils, because they have little, you know, little beaks and they can pick them out real easily. And within an hour, they had them all picked out and the bowl was full again. So Cinderella was super happy. She takes the bowl over to her stepmother thinking, now I can go to the festival. But her stepmother, again, is like, you can't go. She's like, you don't have the proper clothes, plus you can't dance and everyone would laugh at you.
They're all gonna laugh at you!
And Cinderella began to cry. And her stepmother was annoyed by this and she's like, fine. And she's like, if you can pick 2 bowls of lentils out of the ashes within 1 hour, then you can go. And so again, Cinderella goes out to the garden and she calls all her bird friends. So all the little birds, they come flying into the kitchen and they help her pick out all the lentils out of the ashes and into the 2 bowls within a half an hour. So Cinderella takes the 2 bowls to her stepmother, all happy because she thinks, okay, now I can definitely go to the festival. But of course, her stepmother, she's like, no, you can't go. You don't have anything to wear. You don't have a dress or shoes. You don't know how to dance. And, you know, we would be ashamed to be seen with you. And then she turns her back on Cinderella and leaves for the festival with her 2 daughters, and I think the father goes with them as well. Now, after everyone leaves and Cinderella is home alone, she goes out to her mother's grave and she starts to cry. And the little bird that is always sitting in the tree throws down a beautiful gold dress and slippers that are embroidered in silk. And Cinderella puts these things on and she goes off to the festival. Now there, her stepmother and stepsisters and her father, they didn't recognize her. They thought she was some sort of, you know, foreign princess they'd never seen before because she was so beautiful. They figured Cinderella was back at home sitting in the ashes like she always does. Now at the festival, the prince noticed her and he danced with her all night. He didn't dance with anybody else, and he wouldn't let anyone else dance with Cinderella. If someone asked to cut in, he'd be like, no, she's my partner. And so they danced all night, but then when Cinderella got tired and she wanted to go home, the prince said, he's like, I'll accompany you home. But it didn't really say this, but she obviously didn't want him to because she kind of like snuck away from him. But he noticed and he chased after her. He had wanted to accompany her home because he wanted to know which house she lived in so he would know who her family was and he would know who she was. But again, she ran away from him and she ran into a pigeon house. Now, the story didn't say this, but I kind of assumed that this pigeon house was on Cinderella's family's estate, not the palace's, because it said that the prince waited for Cinderella's father and that he told her father all about this strange maiden and how he ran into the pigeon house. And they needed to find out if she was still in there. And the father was like, could that be Cinderella? But he was like, nah. And so he goes and he gets an axe and he tears down the pigeon house. But there was nobody in there. And when her father came into the house, there was Cinderella sleeping by the fire in her rags, just like they assumed she was. Apparently, Cinderella had run into the pigeon house, but then she jumped out on the other side where no one could see her. And she got away. She ran back to the hazel tree, took off the gown, gave it back to the bird, and put back on her kitchen wench uniform. Now the next day when the festival commenced, because remember this is a 3-day festival, her stepmother and her sisters and the father, they all left for the festival. And again, Cinderella, she went out to her mother's grave where the hazel tree was and prayed. And this time the little bird threw down an even more beautiful dress. And when Cinderella got to the festival, everyone was just astonished by her beauty. And the prince had been waiting for her to show up. And as soon as she did, he went over to her and he started dancing with her. And he would only dance with her. And if a man came over to cut in, he'd be like, she's my partner. And when the evening came and Cinderella was done with the dancing and she wanted to go home, the prince decided that this time he would follow her home because he really wanted to know who she was. So he follows her home, but Cinderella must have known that he was following because when she got to their property, she goes and she runs into the garden behind the house. And she climbs up a pear tree. And so the prince loses sight of her. So again, the prince waits for her father to come home. And when he gets there, the prince tells him about this strange maiden that ran up into the tree. And Cinderella's father or stepfather is thinking to himself, must be Cinderella. So the prince tells her father to cut down the tree to see if she's still up there. But after they cut it down, they could see that nobody was in the tree. So the prince leaves and her father goes into the house, and there's Cinderella sitting by the fire just like usual. She apparently had jumped down from the tree on the opposite side where the prince or anybody could see her, ran to her mother's grave where the hazel tree was, took off her gown and put back on her kitchen wench outfit, and ran back inside. Now on the third day of the festival, after her family left, she again went out to the hazel tree and cried and prayed. And this time the bird threw down the most beautiful, the most magnificent gown you'd ever seen, and golden slippers. And when she went to the festival, no one could even speak out of astonishment at her beauty. And again, the prince danced with only her all night and didn't allow anybody to cut in. Now when evening came and Cinderella wanted to go home again, the prince was very anxious to follow her home. But again, Cinderella must have kind of caught on, and Cinderella escaped from him rather quickly. And so he wasn't able to follow her. But it didn't matter because the prince had devised a plan this time. He smeared pitch, which is like tar, all over the staircase that led up to the castle. So when Cinderella was running away, one of her slippers stuck to the tar. Now when the prince found the shoe, the next morning he went to her father. He at least knew what property she belonged to. And he tells the father that he's going to marry the one that fits this slipper and to have all the girls come out and try on the slipper. Now, the stepsisters were very excited about this because they felt they had very pretty feet. So the older sister takes the slipper. She goes into her room with her mother alone. I don't know why the prince allowed this, but he did, to try it on. And she couldn't get her big toe into the slipper. So her mother hands her a knife and she tells her to cut off her toe because, you know, when you're queen, you won't have the need to walk anyway. And she does it. She cuts off her big toe. She forces her foot into the slipper. She swallows the pain and goes back out to the prince. Now, when the prince saw that the shoe had fit, he took her on his horse and they went riding off to make her his bride. But while they were riding, they had to pass the grave and the hazel tree. And in the hazel tree were two white pigeons. And they were like, "Hey, prince," I guess they could talk. I don't know. Somehow they get his attention and they're like, "Look at her foot. Look at all the blood on her foot. This isn't your bride." And he turns and he looks and he sees the blood coming out of the shoe, and he turns the horse around, takes her back to the house, and tells the father, "This is not the right girl." So he had the other sister try on the shoe. And again, the sister takes the shoe and goes into her room with her mother. Now, when this sister tries it on, she can get her toes in, but she can't get her heel in. So the stepmother gives her a knife and she says, "Cut off a little bit of your heel and force the shoe on. When you're a queen, you won't have to walk anyway." So she does this. She cuts off a little bit of the heel, forces her foot into the shoe, swallows the pain, and goes out to the prince. And when he sees that the shoe fits, he's like, "Okay, this is my bride." And he takes her on his horse and they go riding off. As they're riding off, they have to pass the hazel tree, and the two little birds get his attention again somehow, and they're like, "Look at her foot. Look at how bloody it is. This is not your bride." So he looks down at the foot. It's all bloody. He turns the horse around, takes her back to her father. He's like, "This isn't the right girl." Again, he's like, "Do you have any other daughters?" And her father says, "No." So this was the part I was like, okay, this can't be her real dad. There's no way. And he says to the prince that, "You know, I don't have any other daughters, but we do have a little stunted kitchen wench that my previous wife left behind. So I'm like, okay, this has got to be her stepfather, not her biological father. And, you know, he tells the prince that, you know, it couldn't be his bride. She didn't even go to the festival. But the prince insisted on seeing her and having her try on the golden slipper. So the prince sends for her and she tries on the slipper and it fits like a glove. And the prince is stoked. And when Cinderella stands up from trying on the slipper, he recognizes her as the girl he'd been dancing with the past 3 days. And he's like, oh, yes, finally, this is my bride. Now, the stepmother and the stepsisters, they just literally go pale with rage. But the prince takes Cinderella up onto his horse and they ride off. And they too have to pass the hazel tree with the 2 birds. And the 2 birds, they fly off of the tree and they come, and each one of them lands on one of Cinderella's shoulders. So she's riding on the horse with the prince and she's got these 2 white pigeons on her shoulders. Now, at the wedding, the stepsisters, they wanted to try and get in good with Cinderella so that they could share in her new fortune. And so Cinderella must have been okay with this because the 2 sisters accompanied Cinderella to the church. There was a sister on each side of her, and she still had the little birds, one on each shoulder. But as they went into the church, each one of these little birds on her shoulder pecked out one of the eyes of one of the sisters. So this bird pecked out the eye of this sister, and this bird pecked out the eye of that sister. When they left the church, the sisters switched sides, but the little birds pecked out the other eye on this sister and pecked out the other eye on that sister. And so for the stepsisters' wickedness, they were punished with blindness for the rest of their lives. The end. Not like the Disney version at all. And to be perfectly honest, I can kind of see why. One, the story was a little repetitive, kind of the same things happened over and over, just, you know, I'm assuming to establish a pattern here, to show, you know, just how wicked the step family really were, and how good Cinderella actually was. Obviously, the message of the story is the same as the message of the Disney movie. If you're good, good things will come to you. If you're wicked, wicked things will come to you. So yeah, I really liked the story, this version of it. Obviously, I love the Disney version as well, but this one is special too. And I would love to see somebody in the horror genre filmmaking arena do this version of this story. That would be amazing. Somebody call me. Let's make it happen. So yeah, that is one of the oldest versions of Cinderella that we have written down anyway. This story of Cinderella has been a folklore for long before the Grimm brothers 200 years ago. But this is kind of the version that's accepted as the original, even though it's not actually the original. Nobody knows who actually made up this story, but it's mostly credited to the Brothers Grimm. If you liked this video, let me know by giving it a thumbs up. It helps me decide what kind of videos to make, and it lets me know you care. Make sure and subscribe and hit the notifications bell so that you won't miss another horror fairy tale. Is that a new genre? Does that exist already? I don't know. I think I made it up. Maybe I didn't. I probably didn't. If you can think of it, it probably already exists these days. And I will see you in the next one. Bye! That I have taken out of my complete collection of the Brothers Grimm fairy tale. Okay, so Cinderella by the Brothers. And the 2 sisters and the mother forced her to become a kitchen. And he kind of chased after, and he chased, and she escaped from him rather quickly and early. And she still had the little birds, one on each. And so for the stepsisters' wickedness, it helps me decide what kind of